child portrayed in the novel. And again, looking for, we talked about last time, figurative language, but also specific narrative events, attitudes, acts, specific acts. And you can draw on the first 100 pages. But let's try to compile a little bit of a picture of how the child is portrayed here, and then we'll talk about it as a class. Just take a few minutes to do that.
So that's how far we're at. I just don't want to spoil that. Okay, gotcha. Okay, yeah. And then as far as but that's I think. I don't know. What else can you say? What else happens to? I'm super surprised. Did Edwin? Yeah. So like it shows there too. The boyfriend's just like, yo, I'm gonna just do whatever I want, you know, like, and just takes. But she likes it, and I think that's just like you are. Yeah. I have no idea, like, what you could tell. It's pretty much so yeah, so was the possibility. Like, I wish I had more background because maybe it is like maybe it is not. Oh, I see him as the guy, yeah. And then Edwin, it was so sad that Edwin was like, I want to eat food because I was neglected. I was just like, oh, that's tough. I know, right? And then just like, no, never mind. I don't think that's what it was. Oh, wait, yeah. Well, I could just watch that. Kids are saying, well, there's more to it too. Actually, there's a lot more to it. Yeah, you haven't gotten that far yet.
Okay, let's talk about this question. How is the child portrayed? Get started. Kalina, right?
Really gullible and like both of the children that got abducted, they like readily jumped into the white car.
Okay, gullible because jumped. Charlie?
I don't know if this is like specifically what you're looking for, but
I'm trying not to look for anything. I'm just trying to.
Well, when Reinhardt is like implicitly described as a child, it's all these like really negative aspects of children. Like basically his whole thing is I'm going to poke you until you respond, and then I'm going to be upset about it.
Okay, figurative child, Reinhardt. And what are you putting your finger on that he provokes?
Like he just like specifically when he says I have friends coming over in like 30 minutes, and then he like looks for a response. Like I have friends coming over, looks for a response. In 30 minutes, pushing further, looking for a response, and keeps like aggravating Christine until she's like, okay, fine, whatever. Okay,
so it's like self-aware provocation.
Yes.
Where you choose to purposely box someone in order to get a response out of them.
Something like a super child thing.
Okay. I mean, you could say it's a more sophisticated version of the tantrum, right, where I'm going to throw myself on the floor and put you in a bad place unless you give me this thing, right? So that you raise the emotional stakes. I mean, that's very typical in relationships too, where part of the power dynamics, right, is that someone's willing to go farther than the other person emotionally, right? To really push until they get their way, right? And so part of what we see there is his willingness to push further than she is. Right? Christina is depicted as retiring and not that assertive or not that aggressive, and as a result, he kind of tends to push her around, and he's willing. And he does that right away, right? Because he's willing to just jump in there and push. Yeah, what's your name?
Kirsten.
Kirsten. Yeah.
I think another example of Reinhardt being like a child is he could, when we were talking earlier, he could only focus on the case, like kind of case over everything he does.
Okay.
So he's not able to. He doesn't do anything else. It sounds like for months. He just kind of focuses on the
Okay.
case and always go down and buy some newspaper every day to see what his mom is saying.
So maybe that's part of his childishness in thinking about the depiction of the child. If we take this argument, Reinhardt is depicted as a child, then these are features of his depiction or representation. That's a fancy way of representation that it's not a real person, it's a character. And what we need to just remember that is that the author has made choices to try to shape our understanding of this character rather than thinking of it as like a real person, right? But the single-mindedness and lack of perspective, that's kind of childish to get that focus overly narrowed in on something. Yeah, great. Ben?
Attention seeking, so I forget the guy's name, but the kid that was overweight, like...
Edmund, right?
Yeah, where he was just like seeking his mother's attention. And I don't know if it was when he went out to buy an ice cream and he stayed out there for a long time
Mhm.
and knew her boyfriend was coming or something like that. So, in that, in regards to, I guess, he just wants like attention all the time and only wants mom to focus on the other person. What she wants to do.
Okay, so attention-seeking, kind of manipulation. I guess what you're saying is that he's withholding his presence from her in order to make her worry, and as a result, focus on him instead of the boyfriend who's coming over. So that attention-seeking is a kind of way of making himself the center of emotional attention. Cameron?
Also, in regards to Edwin, he has no urge control.
Okay.
Like he ate about half a dozen popsicles, and the problem is his mother is not inflicting a sense of self-control upon him because she just gives in to whatever he wants.
Okay.
So in turn, he can't control his own urges.
So you're saying the mother is also we see a little lack of self-control. Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. Lack of self-control. That's not childish because I know lots of adults who don't have any like me. Right? I mean, but yeah, we definitely think like part of maturation is learning to control your urges. And of course, there's a parallelism here, right? What's the problem with the perpetrator? He lost control, right? He failed to control his urges. Or that's said a couple times, right? So, if it's said 3 times, if you see an image 3 times in a film or something is said 3 times a week, that's pretty clearly they're trying to hammer it home, right? So yeah. Kaya.
Along with Ben's point, we were also talking about how both boys were raised by single mothers, so they probably wanted the full attention of their mothers.
Okay. So this is an excellent point. Boys raised by single mothers, right? Family. This is where it's a very, I think, important to pay attention to this kind of stuff. And I just remember, I just see Gabrielle here who mentioned she was in this crime scenes course. And one of the films we watched in that course is M. It's because it's a film from 1934 by a German director named Fritz Lang, and it's about the story is very similar to this. Several little girls are abducted, and so the whole city mobilizes to find the killer, and it's about the investigation and competing sort of entities trying to conduct the investigation. But the film ends on a kind of a trial scene, and then it ends with the mother of this girl who was abducted and murdered, and she's saying, "Oh, the mothers, the mothers." And the thing about it is you wonder, is the film blaming the mothers? If they would have been paying closer attention, would this crime have happened? And so then, the reason I mention that example is because, is this film blaming these poor women whose children were abducted? Is the fault theirs that their children were somehow more vulnerable? This is one of the things that as soon as you start talking about children is that it's not just the children, right? But the family, the society. You know, you can the blame game. You can play in a lot of different directions. So glad that Kaya brought this up, noting where they fit in the society. Charlie, you had.
This is still on this point. With the lack of a father figure in that house, in like those households, would that like more incline these children to be like sweet talked into this gentleman's car?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer for that. One thing I should say, just to contextualize here, is that like half of people in the Nordic countries nowadays, half of people living in long-term relationships get married. So extremely low rates of marriage, and not unusual for people to have, they don't get divorced if you're not married, but to have one or two families, right, where you start again or whatever, get remarried, the equivalent of getting remarried. And so there are very liberal views, I guess we could say, about family structures and pretty low expectations about what exactly the norm is. So I just say that to make sure that it's clear that I don't think it's like I'm not trying to say it's like a family values novel, but where it's like it has to be a certain kind of family, and that's the problem here, and that this is like it's like a attack on non-normative forms of family. But I do think that it's interesting to note that at the same time, and Charlie's point of a lack of father here is sort of a corollary to the point raised by Kaya, kind of spinning up Ben earlier. Gabrielle?
That was a little bit related to the last two too, but being an only child, where like if you have a sibling, then maybe you'd be like spending more time with that sibling.
Right. So Edwin or I'll put Jonas, and Edwin. They're both only children. Another part of the depiction. Ben? I'm sorry, Austin.
Evidence kind of like the welfare state, and precedent is that Edwin's teacher suggests that his obesity is kind of child abuse on his mom's part. He says there's no physical abuse, but you could argue that obesity is abuse.
There's a lot of emphasis placed on Edwin's body, right? That it's somehow a mark of neglect or inattention or like some kind of problem. Right, where there's like a politics of the body there, you could say. Because Edwin is a symptom, in other words. That's a symptom that the teacher reads and kind of diagnoses. Tao?
I think it's like both point out that in the middle about the relationship and often mother with the child. It's like they are it's like giving, like sometimes they are weak against the child and then they take care of them. And it's like contradicting with the murderer. He's mentioned about his childhood being his mom like kind of abused him a little bit. Yeah, so I was seeing like the contradiction between the two because both of the victims, both of the child is like was like being taken care of the mother's carefully.
Okay, so that these children, Edwin and Jonas, are kind of taking care of their mothers, whereas our perpetrator seems to have been abused by
the mother. Yeah, so I see the contradiction between the two. It's like the connection.
Contradictory mother-son relationships, right? It's all about mothers and sons. But some interesting. I think the crime novels. Very common technique is these kinds of alignments of characters, where that's where when you look for alignments and parallels between the characters, you start seeing the points the novel is trying to make, they come into greater clarity. And that's one thing to ask here. How do the characters get aligned? I was talking to Charlie during the break, who made a great point that at the beginning of the novel, Reinhardt, right, is wearing a white jacket, and it says that Christine is wearing a raspberry jacket. And then you remember the passage we read about mixing milk and raspberry jam. This is the killer, and it's. I have no. Charlie was very acute in her reading and noticing that. It certainly went past me, but you can. That's an alignment. That's a question. Why? That's not a mistake, right? But what's the point? What's the connection that you would argue is trying to be made there? And that's the kind of thing I'm asking. The kinds of points I'm hoping you'll look for, because there's no answer to that question. You have to make an argument. You have to explain what you see there and use evidence to support your point of view. Right now, we're looking for the child, though. So let's keep on that. Here, Hannah.
We talked about how the parents are very trusting about the environment that they live in, and kind of let their kids go off on their own and probably over.
Yeah, it's a great point. That this is one huge difference between the Nordic countries, in my experience, and Seattle, or where many American cities, where kids 10 years old are walking around doing whatever they do, and the parents kind of check in on them, but they're not carting them around in their cars from place to place. Right? It's a big crisis, right, when the parents start driving their kids to school. Everyone is in panic mode. Well, that's right. That's the way we do it in other parts of the world. So it's interesting to think, what are the attitudes there about children in that regard, and we see that in the novel. Jennifer?
I also want to comment. The child is depicted as having no boundaries.
Okay.
Almost because, for example, when Stinger and Scar were
Yeah.
going around and asking the kids, "Oh, did you get the letter?" after Edwin went missing, they said that they did receive the letter, but still the parents didn't give them any extra rules or any strict rules to tell them you shouldn't go out by your own.
Uh-huh.
And then beforehand, when they were tracing Jonas August's route he walked, there was that one small cottage in the middle of the forest where the little girl was at home. And when I read that, I was a little surprised because I had after Jonas August.
Yeah.
The news of him had spread.
Uh-huh.
And the fact that the parents still left her alone.
Yeah.
In the forest was kind of appalling.
Yeah, so definitely this sense of maybe different kinds of boundaries here. What are the boundaries in the novel? And then again, it's a question: is this? You have to make an interpretation. Is that included? That doesn't need to be there, right? Is that included to make the point, or to say this is the indifference? Then we get back to that kind of point, it's the parents' fault. They're not paying adequate attention. They're indifferent to their children. They're not taking care of them adequately. Elizabeth?
Yeah.
I think the kids are also really overly trusting because they see a car driving through their neighborhood really slowly all the time, and no one says anything about it. And when I was little, I saw cars we didn't know at all. That would have been weird.
Right. Everyone's probably can recall some experience of the red van that drove around the block twice or whatever, that everyone was warning you about or so forth. That was one from my child. It was a molester in a red van, stay inside, But, which becomes a joke later on, right? So that the trusting children, that they're sort of naive beyond the naivete of children. Yeah, so here's a lot of thoughts here about children. We're gonna leave this for now, and I think you can see it's fairly broad, and there's some contradictory points in these and different ways of taking a look at this stuff. But keep your eye on this issue as we go forward, because especially the Edwin plot gets developed in a way that reflects on this idea of the child. Yeah, Tolupe.
Kool-Aid. Almost there, it's all good. Just out of curiosity, have you ever tried milk with jam?
No, I have not had milk. I don't put jam in my milk. I put my yogurt, but not my milk. Give it a try. Anyone try it? Anyone do that? Yeah. People have their different ways of, the different things they like to do with their food. The thing that I want to turn to next is it kind of tied up part of the idea of we talked about childhood and innocence. Another question then is if this is a book also about sex and sexuality, right, in a kind of a deviant way, a deviant sexuality, right? I think pedophilia, we recognize that that's the way we tend to think about it. What is the book, like in the first half, how would you describe the book's attitudes toward, or what attitudes do we see here toward sexuality? And part of the reason for asking this question is that I think it's pretty sympathetic to the perpetrator. And so I think by maybe talking about this one, then we kind of, again, set up some ideas about what's going on here that we can return to as we make sense of the novel next week. So let's take a few minutes to talk about that. What would you argue are the book's attitudes toward sexuality? And let's just you can try to point to specific passages or examples that we can talk about as a class. So let's take a few minutes to do that now.
I think they're just trying to say, like, hey, look, pedophilism isn't as bad as, like, someone else who has a different, like, foundation. It's not their fault that it's very philosophical. Scar's the one, right? He keeps questioning, right? Yo, like, he's like, yeah, underage girls. I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
Yes. Which you actually figure out, by the way. You'll read about why the perpetrator is just like, I'm not saying, I'm just saying, read about it.
Yeah, trying to ease into saying, that's what I'm saying, like, then she starts to, because the sweet was 15, or like 16.
Well, this doesn't even make sense in the U.S. too. What is it? Depends on the age, though, right? Like, really? I thought it's dependent on age. Because if you were, if the guy was 16 and the girl was 16, I feel like, isn't that okay? Someone else is 18. Oh yeah, stop doing that. He says I'm not doing that. I do have to agree. Like when I see some girls, like when I see like high school, it's weird. What are you trying to achieve? Like. They're sneaker heels. Totally get sneakers. Totally make moves and stuff. Yeah, that's true. That's very, very true. Not only that, I think that actually.
Okay, let's hear what people had to say. So now we were turning to this issue of the depiction of sexuality here, and it's kind of a broad question. It doesn't have to be about pedophilia necessarily, but that's obviously one of the main issues here. To Pule.
I think when it comes to sexuality, the book's pretty, I don't know, like open-minded, because I've never thought of the pedophiles like stage of thinking while they're doing it before reading the book. And the passage that I not liked, but that made me like, whoa, was like how it compared it to being the same, like not the same thing, but like the concept of being gay. How it's like, it's they're like affectionate and whatever, what they desire is the other person, and it's like the same thing as like pedophiles, except theirs is for little kids. So it's like, I don't know, it was just really open-minded, and it like and I've never thought of it like that. And, but it's like the fact that it's towards children is what makes it not okay.
Okay, so open-minded, it's trying to, I guess with the example you gave, you're trying to, or you're arguing that it's trying to push your concepts, right? Push sort of assumptions, concepts by, let's see. And I'll put notions, which are maybe like a little broader than concepts about sexuality, desire. Good. Kelly.
Quoting a passage. Edwin's mom, I can't remember her name, and then her boyfriend. And she's like sitting in her kitchen.
Maybe you could give a page number for us?
It's page 94.
Okay.
It's like the second spot. It's the last full, the only full paragraph.
Okay.
It's at the bottom. He was assertive in an attractive way. He never asked her permission if he wanted her. He just took her whenever he wanted to. She liked being possessed, like that he forced her arms back and satisfied himself. So there's like that demonstration of power, and then paralleling that with Christine and Reinhardt's relationship. There's
You want to just stop for a second. You said it was an excess of power. Do you just want to elaborate a little bit on, like, what's your argument about that passage?
Like, there's like that demonstration of power, but that's okay. She's okay with it, even though it's kind of, for some people, that is an act of violence.
Okay.
But there's that. It's that is technically consensual, even though.
Right.
Trivialities. That was page 94.
Okay. So I just want to make sure we get demonstration of power and active. Right. So demonstration of power, desired, an act of violence from another point of view.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yes.
So, we'll just kind of catalog them here, and then we can kind of put them together. You got another point?
Yeah. Paralleling that with Christine and Reinhardt's relationship, there's a passage that I didn't bother finding, and I'm not sure if it's before or after.
Mm-hmm.
But Christine's trying to do something like get ready or whatever. She's cooking dinner, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then Reinhardt comes up and is like trying to like get her to sleep with him or something. And she's like, I really don't want to do this right now. I'm trying to cook. And he's like, I don't even like your cooking. Blah, 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 blah. Sleep with me.
Okay.
And like that's completely unwanted from her. And
okay. Coercive. Should we say coercive?
I don't think she ends up doing it.
Sexual expressions. This kind of like idea that he's kind of that he's forceful and kind of forceful in a negative way in his relationship to her. Cassie.
The idea of control type of sexuality also Stephen and Star and Milan are talking about had a case about sexuality, and one of them, Seeger, says that for pedophiles it's only like a matter of control, but like it's whether they choose to like control it or not control it is whether they act upon those feelings. And so that's kind of mirrored with this other sexuality power thing.
Right. Okay. So that this is right. Skara and Say are talking about it in this kind of philosophical way. And you said it mirrors other depictions associating sexuality and power. So maybe that part of that part of what we're saying here then, or the way the novel depicts sexuality, is that it associates it with control, and control has to do with power, in as much as it can be, right, an expression of power. Right, Reinhardt seems to be someone who's into being in control and being the empowered person, and that means imposing on others his view of things, or his desires, right? And so this is just a point about how the novel makes the connection between, sex is just one more thing for him, where he wants to show that he's the one in control. So this is like creating kind of a bunch of strands going together around power. Other points. What's your? I can't remember your name. What's that? Bailey. Bailey, thank you.
This kind of really about children before. Children are kind of visually asexual.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of goes along with you went to the book that children people are just picked up by the guy in the band who's not really thinking the man could violate me, whereas like if like we were picked up by something in the band,
Right. Yeah.
Again, kind of the relationships between childhood and sexuality and how that doesn't come.
Okay, so there's like a disconnect. There's this disconnect, and Bailey suggests that the reason for the disconnect is because of sort of sexual maturation, right? That kids who are sexually immature, they don't understand the consequences of a situation, whereas the adult, the mature adult recognizes the way these things work, and on the basis of experience, knowledge, and so can assess things in a more sophisticated way. So this is something, this is maybe about situations too, as well. This is actually, it's worth thinking about here. There's a, to speak about sexuality, right? Freud has this famous sort of terms that he uses. People that come up, Freud is not obviously sort of current for psychology, but it comes up in people talk about literature. Freud distinguishes between objects and aims, and the object is the person or the thing you want to do it with, right? And the aim is the thing you want to do, right? And so, but the object can be like in Freud's famous argument, like the fetish object. It could be a shoe, right? And the aim might not be to necessarily, have intercourse with the shoe or whatever, but rather to like look at it, right? So that you can have this displacements. That's his whole part of his big theory, is that people have these sorts of displacements away from, say, the sex act itself to other forms, other aims, right? They want to do other things. And this is one thing that the novel is kind of working with, is to say that some of those situations, that's what the people want, actually, right? And it's the aim is actually the situation, not some sort of like, intercourse of one kind or another. So this is maybe something to think about too, is that sometimes it's they're working, the deviant, right, is working for something else. They get their satisfaction somewhere else than some kind of normative notion of a sex act. Kaya?
With the conversation Kathy was talking about in bar was that I think that the book kind of pushes the boundaries of what's societally acceptable. They were chatting about how what if someone who's 16 has sex with a 15-year-old and they'll be with a sex offender and someone finds out. Because if you go across the border to Sweden, someone that won't happen in person, and then he goes on to say, well, with these people, like pedophiles, where's their outlet? So I think it kind of pushes what is happening in society and how they can change it and how they can make it better and more beneficial.
I'll put and relationships, right? So I think Kaya's pointed out that it seems to be pushing the envelope a little bit. We're wanting to make you think about, like a border means the difference between sex offender and just living life, right? So that the two, it raises, that's a moral question, right? Is it right to make those kinds of, if I don't know about the laws about like sex offender, but if you're a sex offender in Washington State, that's a serious problem for you, right? Where you can live and announce being on the web and whatever. People don't like that. And so, you can think about the kind of legal ramifications of these kinds of things. And is the novel asking us to, to what degree and in what way is it asking us to consider those things? It's certainly trying to paint a more murky picture than maybe would be the easy way, which to just say, pedophile, throw away the key, right? Yeah, Austin.
It definitely humanizes and kind of gives
Yeah.
weird ones and things like that. So it's it's not just pedophiles, but people with deviants. And it also they show the pedophile's perspective, both one who's taking the kids and the older guy that's really the friendliest guy in the world. So they show the real people, they have regrets, and they know what they're doing is wrong for the children, but they have regrets. So really humanizing.
Okay, so in these examples of the people, they kind of both the interior monologue of the perpetrator and this Philip Okeson, right, this other convicted pedophile, it sort of humanizes them in ways. The Okeson, right, he's very charming, right, and it's even our perpetrator, right, we'll find as we've had, he's a much darker figure, but even he gets a little bit of charm, and of course that's part of it is the characterization, right? Is that as they say in their conversations, the two investigators, and part of the kind of the lore of these kinds of things when parents warn you against predatory sexual predators or whatever. That part of it is they're very charming, right? They have a way of speaking to children. They say this right here that they exploit the vulnerability by charming children, right? It's like the Pied Piper. They know how to play the music in a way that leads the children away, that bewitches them, whatever. And so in humanizing, it's also sort of, you kind of have to do it in a novel like this because you have to show, to be credible, you have to show that they have some sort of charms that make them able to do what they do sort of practically, right? If they're going to have to sort of persuade some child to get in a car or whatever. Other stuff here, but this is more going toward the pedophile. Jennifer.
The book also touches upon homosexual relationships, and for example, when they talked about the teacher Alex having a homosexual relationship with another man, and it was the children who were informing the police, Sayer and Scar, about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like they're very, very extremely open-minded, like someone mentioned first.
Okay.
Open-minded about homosexuality, and that it helps to draw a clear line and distinction between what's morally right and your sexual desires. Because someone earlier in the book, I think it was Sayer, he said that it's okay if it's a man and a man, but if the desire is one that draws someone towards a child, then that's inexcusable.
Right, so that this is you can say that the novel in a way is, on the one hand, trying to create greater nuance or push the envelope or whatever we said, but at the same time, it wants to defend some moral lines and legal lines, and here it's suggesting, right, as Sayer says, the problem with the pedophile, right, is they step across the legal line, right, where morally, they seem to be, as Jennifer argues, that, for example, Alex, this guy, living with his husband, right? That the children are always there, and sort of stands as kind of one of the likable characters in the novel, right? And so we have both morally and sort of psychologically, we have a great sympathy for this character. So this is then, in other ways, if you take a kind of the old-fashioned notion of deviance, anything that's not heterosexual, right? That all gets thrown into the category of the deviant. Then the novel's attacking that kind of thinking at the same time as it's wanting to, think about some of these categories. So here, sexuality is both set of categories it's trying to defend, same time as it's arguably trying to push the way we think about those. Gabrielle.
Well, I was just that kind of touches, or what I'm thinking kind of touches on the moral and legal aspect. I feel like when the book talks about like a man and man together as comparable to like a person and a child, that like the main issue with that is the consent that they talk about a lot.
Okay.
Because I feel like if it's like two men together, two women together, like generally speaking, there is some sort of consent.
Right.
And,
right.
And when a child is involved, it's not just like, oh, they're young. It's just like
that's the problem, right? For any defense of the pedophile is that the child can't give consent legally, right? That's why that's the idea of statutory rape, right? Is that the child is a minor, they cannot give consent, and as a result, to have sexual interaction with that person as another minor or as a adult is to open yourself up legally, right? Because of the way that the law defines consent and childhood. So this is, that in that way, the sex and the child are incomparable to other forms because consent is not possible legally, right? So this is a point that Gallo makes a very good point, that in the emphasis on consent, that's more of that legal distinction that came up in Jennifer's comment. Other things? Okay, so we're sort of coming. We have like 10 minutes left here. I had another question, but I'm going to put that off. Let's pick up the last keyword, violence. And the question I'd like to end on then is this a novel about violence? Yes or no, and then your argument. Obviously, it's not an easily parsed yes or no, but let's just think about it a little bit, and yes or no, and then kind of the argument that you would make to support your answer. Let's just take a few minutes to talk about that in small groups, and then we'll talk about it as a class.
I said yes. I said yes or no. She said.
Well, I thought you said.
Oh no! I said. No. Personally, I don't know. I want to hear yours. I already got mine. I just make it. That's the violence. She all puts it up in my face. She's like, yo, you didn't finish the book. Act, right? Not even that. It's just like every time he does it too. Yeah, right? Like every time he has like that hurt. I don't know. For me, it's just like if I ever have sex, it's like I always regret after. I never regret it like during. It's always after. It's like, oh damn, that's just happened. Right, and anyway, he's the same level. So I just feel like I don't think he doesn't like it himself. He's like, he's just like, I don't. He's still killing children. Though. That's still like you don't do that for no reason. Like, you know what I mean? It's one thing to like help a child, but it's another thing to raise a child. That's what you know what that means it is a bunch of our lives. Look at a shirt, give it away.
We did not do that.
No, I don't think
Okay, let's take a couple of minutes to tie these strands together. Here we had to say, and then we'll finish up. So the question was, in a way, it ties some of the points about the child and sexuality together. But is it a novel about violence? Why? Charlie.
I don't think this is a novel about violence, but it definitely addresses violent topics.
Okay.
Definitely like Tula and Ingemar's relationship, and Christina Reinhardt's relationship. Spoiler alert: he like violently threatens her at some point, and that's terrifying. So there's like the dynamics in those relationships, and then there's the relationships between the children and the pedophile gentleman, or like that.
Okay, so that it's not about overt violence, but some of the relationships have violent dimensions to them that are part of the themes. Yeah, name again?
Samantha. I was in this novel about causes of violence and understanding where violence stems from.
Okay, so that's one way to think about it, that we don't see sort of explosions of violence, but the attitudes that are kind of the root of violent actions. And so in that way, it's trying to, in a way, not be spectacular, but be more subtle in thinking, prodding us to think about the sources of violence in society, causes of violence. That's a neat way to think about it, for sure. Hannah.
I thought it was more about power.
Okay.
Rather than violence, but obviously with
Yeah, great point. That it's about power in some ways and the exercise of power, which can lead to violence, right? The attempt to enforce one's power, right? What's power? The capacity to get your way, in a very sort of simplistic definition. I mean, that's one way to think about power. And that's like the problem for the pedophile, right? They can't get their way, right? Without crossing a legal line. And so, and they don't have any power, right? And so it ends up being violent because they're caught in this box. So, we're talking about disempowered people in a sense, and we would all argue, rightfully so, right? There's a reason for those laws that think about the child, but then on the other hand, then Reinhardt, he can kind of do what he wants, and is that legit? What do we think of that? So, in a way, to Samantha and Hannah's point, right? It's juxtaposing different kinds of relationships and inviting us to think about the power dynamics involved in them. Other thoughts? Violence. Yeah, Agnes.
And it's, I guess, pretty self-explanatory, but for the author to use children as a subject of kind of bringing out the thought of violence, I think that really helps reader capture the contrast between, we're coming up with these terms like power, control, and like authority, and to think of like children being the ones victimized and witnessing that with these acts of violence, whether they're related to pedophiles or sexual offenders. So I guess.
So in a way, it makes very concrete, pretty power. It's a very abstract word, right? But it makes it very concrete when we think about the consequences for a child, right? Death of a child is very horrible. One of the most horrible imaginable circumstances, right? For both the parents and people around the child. I think everyone probably would agree with that. Cameron?
So far, at least at this point in the novel, like, any violence that has happened, we haven't seen. It's very subtle. We only see the aftermath. Like, any violence that's happened is undercurrent.
Okay,
so we've only seen the effects of
right. It's not overt, right? We see kind of consequences, but not violent acts themselves. And maybe that's in some ways echoes what Samantha was saying, that it's about causes rather than the spectacle of violence itself. So yeah, well, that provides, I think, a good set of themes to keep going with, and we'll finish up the novel next week and put some of this, get some more clear arguments about what's going on here. Have a good weekend.